everybody, and welcome to another Polestar Pilates Hour. I'm really excited to be back hosting again today and sharing some information about the side arm twist, an exercise that I've really grown to love. All right. So I thought we would start off today, as I realize sometimes we get into these and I start talking about different parts of the exercises, and I thought it might be good to show a video, just a little clip of Brent and me working together on side arm twist, just so everybody is familiar. So we'll get that playing. There we go. And so this is on the chair, and it's in a very similar position to where we might do reverse swan or teaser. And there are quite a few things that we'll keep in mind. One of them is the placement of the body on the chair, so in this case, the pelvis, and what's happening around the shoulder girdle. And then, of course, the part that is the challenge is finding balance with the legs outstretched. And Brent there has got his hand in the video. He's talking about kind of a safety position to be in if somebody wasn't familiar with the exercise. And so he has his hands over my legs just in case if I was going to lose my balance, my legs might float up quickly. And so that's what he's talking about at that moment. He's not trying to make it harder for me by pushing my legs down. So that's the exercise. And of course, I wrote down all the things that we need, and we'll discuss those. What are the exercises that can really prepare us for this movement? What are just some helpful tips and things that we can do, maybe even outside of the Pilates studio? Those of you that are familiar with the Polestar assessment tool or the Polestar screening, I've brought in a couple of items from that as to what we could look at early on in someone's practice to make sure that we're getting them ready to do this exercise in a number of months, or for some people it might take a couple of years to get ready to be at that point, and just a couple things to avoid. So we'll get right. So one of the things that we need is fairly clear, is we need good thoracic rotation mobility, because this is what this exercise is about. We are trying to find the balanced point and then go into rotation. So because it's a little bit precarious, because we're having to balance ourselves, the torso, the spring load, which is helpful, but could also be a little bit challenging to push down against the spring if it's maybe too heavy or much too light. And then we've got to deal with our legs. So we've got gravity pulling our legs down a bit, and all of that's happening, and we're asking for this smooth and lovely thoracic rotation. So really important that throughout our own bodies and through working with our clients, that we're working on thoracic rotation. And I would say work from the top and also work from the bottom. So exercises that I like right from the beginning, I'm thinking of things like book opening, right? And that has different names in different schools, but lying on your side, arms outstretched, and then taking the arm either bent and going back. It could be straight and going back. It could have hands behind the head, but opening the rib cage toward the ceiling with the legs staying over to the side. So we're getting that sense of rotation in and out of the position. And I will say a tip on that, if you haven't heard me recently talking about the book opening, sometimes we're quite strict as teachers about maintaining the legs stacked one on top of the other and maintaining the hips perfectly stacked while we're opening the upper body. And if you're working with somebody who really has decreased range of motion, so they don't have much access to thoracic mobility, they may have it, but they don't really know how to move in that way, or maybe they really don't have the range of motion yet. Let the top leg, toward the end of the movement, let the top leg slide back a little bit. You're going to make the exercise a little bit more enjoyable, because you can imagine if you didn't have much movement and you started to open toward the ceiling and then you just kind of got stuck there, and it's not very satisfying. So make sure when you go you can get the body around a little bit, and some people will need to move their top leg back. Once somebody has the movement, then reaching the knee a little bit forward, or at least keeping the two legs stacked together, can also be helpful. Then we get that feeling of opposition. So my upper body is turning one way, while relatively my lower body, my leg, and my pelvis are reaching the other way. That leverage also makes it easier to turn a little bit. So I've just been playing with that a little bit. So you can try that on with your clients to see if they have a nice experience with both of those variations. And then I would do things like side to side. So lying on the back with the legs either at tabletop, could be very basic with the feet flat on the floor and the knees bent, and starting to take the legs and the pelvis into rotation. So now we're getting the rotation from the pelvis up through the lumbar spine, which doesn't rotate that much, and then into the lower thoracic spine. Both directions of this movement are important. And then we've got a lot of other, just the spine twist exercise from the mat work. There's opportunities once somebody has the motion in their spine to work on it. So seated footwork or double leg press or double leg pump on the chair. You could easily, while somebody is pressing through the legs, add rotation of the torso. So could be hands again across the chest, could be behind the head, out to the side. Lots of different variations where the lower body is doing the leg press and the upper body is doing rotation at the same time. Make sure, especially in all the positions, I would say especially in sitting, but it's important really in all the positions, to rotate from the lower part of the rib cage and keep the oval opening of the ribs right in line with the oval opening of the pelvis. Sometimes I'll take a couple of magic circles and hold them on top of one another. And often we go into extension when we're rotating. Sometimes that's great. Sometimes it's not that helpful. So at first, really try to maintain the alignment of the ribs and the pelvis. And many different cues about that. I really like to talk about the alignment of the two, because that's what we're doing. I don't want my ribs to travel forward or my pelvis to tuck under. I want to keep those two ovals aligned with one another. And we could think even farther up and down. That could be in standing aligned over the ankles. It could be now this even more oval position of the shoulder girdle, can be over the ribs, can be over the pelvis, and of course the head can be stacked on top of that. So be mindful of those little tiny adjustments for your clients, because overall it's going to make them more capable at rotating their spine without putting into a little bit of flexion or a little bit of extension until it's wanted, and then it's great. And of course we do have those variations. So the other thing that's really important in this exercise, in addition to all of those things that I've talked about, is the ability to get the hip joint, right? So you saw the pelvis on top of the chair and the legs outstretched, to get the hip joint into as much neutral position as possible. It might even be helpful to have a little bit of hip extension. People are lacking that nowadays. We don't really always get into hip neutral or hip extension, but that's another important part. And not only do we need to have the range of motion, but we also need to have the control there. And that's really the challenging part of this exercise. How do I keep my legs up in the air while I'm balanced on my sacrum, the big triangular bone at the back of the pelvis? How do I balance my pelvis on top of the chair and maintain my legs? So I'll give you some tips for that as well. So that's another important piece to it. Also, shoulder, right? The shoulder. So taking care to put the hand where it's helpful. So sometimes we think the hand must be directly behind the body, um, because that's the ideal position. But a lot of people can't get their arm all the way back and shoulder extension back here to even be able to start that motion. So in the beginning, it's okay if the hand is a little bit to the side. Give people, again, these little stepping stones to get into it instead of trying to be 100% from the get-go. It's going to be fine if when they're learning it, their motion goes a little bit more over here as opposed to going all the way around, as we would say, kind of on spot. So the spine stays in its alignment, thinking about the sagittal and the coronal planes, right? We don't want to add flexion, extension, or side bending. We really just want rotation. But in the beginning, again, we have to give our clients a little bit of help, and it might be more comfortable to have the hand a little bit to the side. The body won't be perfectly aligned, but the shoulder might be. So it's important to keep that going and make sure that you're working all of the movements. And I hear this often from different teachers, different schools. Exercises like maybe a serving motion, or we have this bent arm position during exercises like rowing, and straight arms, going back past the neutral position of the shoulder into shoulder extension. And I hear teachers often say, oh, don't do that. And if there's a reason why, that's of course fine. We want to have reasons why we're doing things. It certainly is a little more challenging from an awareness standpoint to bend my arms and stop when my upper arm is in line with my torso if I don't have anything to feel, to help me there. I might, on the reformer, if I was lying down, my elbows would eventually touch the mat. So that's why sometimes I ask people to hold their elbows a little off the mat, because it changes the proprioception and the awareness around the shoulder. But when we have an opportunity to go back into that range of motion, we should be using it, because then we have this available when I might want to do something that involves a tricep press. So the gymnast version on the reformer of tendon stretch and gymnast, I need to be able to go into this tricep press. If I'm doing frog on the chair, I need to have that range of motion. So it's one of those things that we want to work on when it's a little bit less challenging. And so anytime you're doing strap work, whether it's some of the basic kneeling work or rowing, things like that, explore this range of motion a little bit more. And I think it will really benefit your clients there. I'm going to keep going on with a few exercises, a few more of those. One is going into the teaser prep or teaser on the trap table. And this has a few different applications. So I'm going to jump back into the trap table. And yes, I know there's no chair in the shot yet, but there will be. I will be getting on and doing the exercise and showing some of these points that I've been talking about. We're going to start with the teaser prep, sometimes people call it, or teaser on the tower bar, to look at, again, this hip neutral idea. How do we know when we're moving the pelvis where it is in this ideal position? And again, neutral is, to me, is more of a concept of when the joint is in its position where it has all the ranges of motion available to it. So that's what I think of as neutral. And sometimes we've gotten stuck with a very firm application of it. Brent talks about this frequently. It's more of a concept of where, for this body, right, for you or your clients, where is your neutral alignment? So we have some images around that, but of course we need to respect that every body is a little bit different. So I'm going to jump back onto the trap table. And of course we have the prep with the feet down, but where it becomes a little bit more interesting is where the feet and legs are elongated. And so now this is just the same as if I was going to sit on top of the chair I might be reaching back already, yeah, for that. Or I might just have my hands out, and as I roll back, this is where I'm kind of listening in my body to where my pelvis gets to be horizontal, more or less. And then I continue to move my spine, and then I could roll back up, and this would mimic coming back up to sitting on top of the chair. So the client doesn't need to know this yet. They don't need to know that this is a preparation for side arm twist that may come many, many months in the future. But you're already imparting this knowledge to them of not letting the pelvis go a lot past its neutral or horizontal position. So those concepts are important. And then you, of course, can add in rotation. And this is a nice application of a quite easy movement where we talk sometimes about spine rotation, but also neural mobilization, which is going into rotation here. So I can keep my head down and I can move into rotation, and it seems very simple, but this is exactly what's happening. You're just pushing the arm down instead of taking the arm up. So this might also be something very early on that you could work on with your client to see how do they do with this. When I'm introducing rotation for the spine twist, I also like to just do a little prep. You may have done this with me before. Can be in any sitting position, could also be in standing. But getting the sense that rotation is a little bit more three-dimensional. And sometimes we think of reaching for something, maybe if I'm reaching with my left hand, it's the left side of me that comes forward. And that's true, and it does. But we have the other side of the rib cage that also has to be doing something. So a lot of times I think about my right side going back almost more than my left side coming forward. Again, if you haven't done this with me before, just try it wherever you're sitting. You can do a few times on one side. You could even support yourself with the hand or push or pull to give yourself a little bit of leverage. And what does it feel like to really involve the back of the rib cage coming around to the front instead of just thinking about one side going forward? It makes it, again, that more three-dimensional rotation. And do sometimes, in Pilates, we often look at rotation with the head going around. It's part of the choreography. But in real life, if you were going to reach for something, you would reach for it and you would look. Because I don't want to reach for my coffee and accidentally knock it over. I want to reach and grab. And so when you're doing your different rotation movements, especially something maybe where the arms are crossed and you're looking around, do some to look around, but do some where you keep the head forward. And it's just another way to experience rotation that for us as humans is a little more functional, so that we're reaching and grabbing and seeing, or if we're shaking hands, we want to be able to see the person. I don't want to shake hands like that. So that's a little bit of work there. Now, this idea of lengthening through the legs again and getting to our more neutral position, quite often we see many variations of how the pelvis is sitting on top of the leg. And it's very super common to have the tail a little bit back and the pelvis a little bit anterior. Now there are some people who their structure, you're not going to be able to make really big changes in that. You can still always encourage, but we wouldn't want to force anything. For other people, it's more of an awareness exercise where they think this is straight, this feels straight. I fall into this category. I see myself sometimes and I think, oh, well, that's interesting. That's not really as good of a neutral alignment as I can get. And so I can start to feel like my pelvis is sitting on top of my leg bones. I have this oval and now my ribs are back in that same position. So this exercise of side arm twist can be beneficial to my standing posture because it's going to put me actively into this position, but in this unfamiliar way that's a little bit more challenging than just standing up on my feet. So I like to look at it that way as well. And then if you're in a place where you can stand up, and you may have done this with me before, but get your hands involved, either pushing back against your legs, where the push back helps you bring your pelvis forward. That's one way, so just pushing a little bit, or if you had a band or a strap, or sometimes I'll take the dowel from the chair and put that in front of me. So you're pushing back and you're using your arms to give yourself a little leverage to bring the pelvis forward. You can also do the opposite, and you can pull from the back, and quite often this will help you feel like you can get your ribs back. So try both of those. Sometimes I'll do both, and see if that doesn't help you get into this long alignment that we're now going to use when we lie down. See if that helps a little bit, if that works for you as you're in your standing position. Another common exercise that we do that ends up being very fluid and has this lovely range of motion is circumduction. But you can do it where it has a little less of this big round motion, and we can just work on rotation, again, right around the spine without introducing any side bending or any flexion or extension. One hand onto the bar, one hand on the chest, so right over the breastbone, and begin to move away from the bar and rotate. And you can even pull just a little bit on the skin at the front of your chest, very lightly, and help yourself go around a little bit more, and then rotate to come back to face your front. Rotate. And if you have your feet against the upright bars, that's a great place to notice if you're pulling your hip back, which is not going to give you as much rotation, or you can keep the contact with the pole. So you could, of course, have the hand here. Sometimes I like to have the hand behind the head. This is going to start getting me more into the shoulder position of the side arm twist. So then I'll take the hand down. I'm not pushing on anything, but I've now moved myself into a very similar position that I'll use once I get onto the chair. So you can add that in as a preparation to get ready to get into the motion. So do you see people rolling, taking everything? So we talk about twisting. This means having a base, or else we're turning. What's pushing and what's pulling? Great. Okay, I understand. Melissa, if you can leave it up there just for a second so I can keep looking back at that. So the base right now in the full exercise really is your sacrum, right? So the bone at the back of the pelvis. That is what's resting on top of the chair. And so I want you to be mindful of letting the chair support your pelvis. And sometimes a common mistake, or not a mistake, but it's just not particularly useful, is to really engage the buttocks muscles so much that when you get the glute max really engaged, it lifts you off of your sacrum a little bit. So anytime you're lying down, if you do a max contraction, most people will feel like their pelvis actually rises just a tiny bit, just from the girth of the glute muscle. So if you do that, then the bone of the pelvis, right, the back of the pelvis, and the connection of pelvis to the sacrum to the spine, it's no longer being supported by the chair. It's lifted up a little bit. So that's one place that's really important. The other place, as far as pushing and pulling, which I'm glad you use those terms because that's such an important area of contrast or leverage, is the reach of the legs away. And if any of you have studied gyrotonic or gyrokinesis, and certainly if you study with me, you've heard about this concept of the fifth line. And so this area that between the heel and the arch of the foot, where those two areas kind of blend together. And just quickly, if you look at your own foot, take your ankle bones and go around the bottom of your foot from your ankle bones. And you can reach through that point, really like you're standing on your foot out in space. And that's another place where you're going to get the reach one direction that helps you then have a counterbalance to move the opposite direction. And if you've not heard of the fifth line before, it's a really powerful place. And a couple of mistakes that people make is when they flex their foot, they maximally pull their toes back. That's not it. The ankle needs to be in its kind of neutral position, as if you were just standing on the floor, not pulling the toes all the way back, because then you'll miss the feeling of it. But if you think of that area as having energy coming from it, a light, a laser, a color, or if you're standing, you can feel that sense of energy going down to come back up, it's really, really, really useful. And that's why often when we are on the chair, we'll slide the chair just close enough to the wall that somebody can put their feet against the wall. Not only does that little bit of friction help hold the legs up, but it gives you something to push into. So I encourage you, when you're teaching footwork, when you're teaching feet and straps, when you're teaching the leg springs on the trap table, that you're constantly reminding that sense of sending energy away through the foot, and it will really come back to serve you in these situations. And it's sometimes a little hard to find. Sometimes we use too many muscles at first, but as you keep practicing it, it's something that will really help. So I hope that answers your question there. How to correct the standing posture when the tailbone is balled up and not elongated. I don't work too much on the tailbone. And then what I was laughing is because she mentioned the fifth line. I don't know. It's a great suggestion. Maybe we'll talk about the fifth line. I'll bring on some of my gyrotonic friends, and we could have a Pilates hour about that. But I don't really go from the tailbone in the standing position. I'm really more looking at, here is my femur and here is the pelvis sitting on top of it. And I'm looking to see with ease, can I get the pelvis? It's almost like I want to pick the pelvis up and set it down on the legs. And so that's really where I'm going from, that big ball and socket joint. And as I mentioned, there are certain relationships within the spine to the pelvis, sacrum, and femur that you might not be able to change. It might be a structural position that somebody's not really going to make much change of. We can still encourage, but it may not change a lot. Other people, they're just not aware, and you go, oh, can you fix it? And over time, they'll be able to fix it quite well. So that's one of the things that I look at as far as changing the pelvic position. So really go from the pelvis and the femur, as opposed to going to the tailbone. So one of the common, I'd say, modifications, or sometimes it's not even a modification, it's just a preparation, is to have the legs at tabletop. And I've moved away from that. For me personally, it was more challenging to go from tabletop to long legs than it was to put my legs in the position that I needed them to be in and work on it there. And so that's why we'll often take one of the sitting boxes. I'm going to use my stool, but take one of the sitting boxes and put your feet on that. That way, the femur, the relationship of the pelvis to the femur, is in pretty much the same position that it's going to be in once you lengthen your legs. So it's fine to do things at tabletop. If that works for you, please continue to do it. But also, if the clients are having a difficult time of figuring out, okay, I can do this motion with tabletop, but I can't actually get my legs out, then you might think about doing it from the other position. So my stool is just a little higher than a sitting box would be, but you can imagine if the sitting box was there, my legs would be here, and now when I roll back, my legs are more in the relationship that they'll be in to my pelvis than if I'm up here. If I'm up here, it might be more challenging for somebody to get the hip flexors to lengthen because they are working to hold my leg up, and now I have to lengthen from that more active position. This might be a little bit easier to go back and forth from here, and I really learn how to keep my femur and my pelvis in this position. Another thing that I do a lot, and this is before I go into reverse swan and teaser, is I don't put the hands back at all. I use the handles, because a lot of times people have a little bit of fear going back, especially if it's uncomfortable on their shoulder or they're a little bit afraid they might fall. So this is another thing that's really helpful. So holding on to the handles and lowering yourself back and coming up. So now I have all this support. I feel very secure. I can go down and I can come back up, and it's not scary, and I can really feel the position. So I talked a lot, and especially around the question that Danya asked about the sacrum, and it's important that the sacrum really is supported by the chair. One of the worst things you could probably do is scoot back here and start to go back, because nothing is going to keep you from sliding down into the springs. Not particularly helpful. So you want to make sure you're forward enough that when you go back, you now have the ability to keep yourself balanced here. Okay? I mentioned shoulder alignment. We talk about shoulder congruency. And one of the things to think about too is the length of the person's torso with whom you're doing this exercise. And I worked with a young lady who was, she was well over 6 feet tall. She was, maybe 6'4" or 6'5". So we do have clients that are that tall that come in. And when her pelvis was sitting on the chair, where just about everybody else's pelvis is, her arm position, I'm going to move back, so don't do this, but her pelvis was in the correct place in the middle of the chair. But when I got her back here, you can see how my hand is quite a bit closer to the chair than my shoulder. My shoulder is farther away, and that is not going to be helpful either. I will want to get to a point where when I go down, my arm is vertical, more or less vertical here. So you might have to make some adjustments. You might have to stack up some boxes here, or this might be the time that you do need to have the chair right up against the trap table, not to support the legs, but to make sure that the body can get in the right place. So please always take a look at proportions. If somebody has a very long torso, make the adjustments so that they feel supported, but they also have good alignment in their shoulder. Okay, so just some things to think about there. So once all that's going, you've got the position, the person is comfortable going back, the legs are pretty comfortable here now. We can start to add the rotation piece, and again, I would use the handle. So you may be wondering, why is the handle there? It seems like it's a little bit in the way, but it's there on purpose because I want to make people feel as comfortable as possible the first few times they're doing this movement. It's awkward enough. We don't need to make it more awkward. And this goes back to again, that feeling of pushing and pulling. When I don't have all the connections I need, when I don't feel like I'm standing through my feet, when I don't feel the support of my pelvis on the chair or the support from the springs, I don't have a lot of leverage. It's difficult to turn because I'm kind of just out, kind of floating in space. So using the handle can really help you get into rotation a little bit more. And I was just practicing this a second ago when I was just explaining those other motions. So as I go back, I can push against the handle, I can pull against it, really whatever feels comfortable for the person that is doing it. So just doing a few times of rotating, and again, change your hand position, whatever feels comfortable. Sometimes people pull up a little bit on the chair, and that feels helpful. Again, going in opposition and then coming back up. And I'm not too concerned right now with what's happening at the legs and the pelvis. I just want the person to feel secure with going back, so we're not getting things like resting into the head of the humerus and pushing it forward, but it can be pulled back and I can get into more rotation. From here, now I can extend one leg. So I'm rotating to my left. I'm going to extend my left leg, and now I'm really mimicking the shape that I would be in a moment with both legs out, and then change to the other side. Pushing, and again, all of this I can start to play with where I am in space. Not to make it perfect, but to build some awareness. So to be in balance, we have to be able to be off balance. Otherwise, we're just rigid. So when you watch somebody learning how to balance the first time and people say, oh, pretend you're a statue. Not necessarily the best information, because a statue, if you push it and you tip it, it's just going to fall over. We want to be capable of falling off balance and regaining our balance from all the different parts of our bodies. You know, if we're in a handstand or in standing on one foot or something like this. So let people play around. It'll help their overall awareness, and it will give them that sense of, oh, okay, I notice I'm going this way. I notice my hip lifted now. Thanks for pointing that out. And I have a strategy for pulling it back down. And just like I said in the beginning, you might, when I was talking about the book opening and allowing the legs to move, not everybody can keep their legs exactly perfectly still, their pelvis perfectly balanced, and do the movement. Some people will need to have a little rotation in their hips and pelvis to do the movement, and that's okay, right? As long as they're doing the best that they can do, and we're working toward that goal of having no movement or no change at the pelvis and the leg area. All right, so then fast forward, we get into the full movement. So this is where, again, that sense of standing on the feet against the wall is helpful. If I could be on both pieces, if I could have my tower bar in my hands here, this is what I was doing earlier with the tower bar of pushing my legs away and coming back up. So I'm carrying that over from that exercise until I now have the capacity to rotate here, stretching just a little longer from my left leg as I was practicing before, and getting back to this point to then come back up. So that's building up to that motion. Oh, great. So another question. So what do you think is the difference between focusing on the pelvis and focusing on the pubic bone? Okay. And thanks for your patience. I'm always trying to be patient. It's one of my things that I'm working on in my own self. So always like to be patient. Focusing on the pelvis versus focusing on the pubic bone. Well, if any cue, and this goes even back to, I think it was Linda who made the comment about even the tailbone. So we can cue any one of the different bones around where we are. And if the cue works, it works. So if for somebody, you might say something about the pubic bone stretching away a little bit, that might work. Or the pubic bone pulling back a little bit, that could work. That might be something that's really helpful. and it's something that the client can see. So especially maybe if they're doing the version where I was holding on to both handles and just rolling back and coming back up, that might be a place where they could take themselves out of their ideal head and neck alignment and actually look at the pelvis. That's one of the ways that we can really start to gain mastery of our own movement. Sometimes, you say, "Oh, do you notice this or that?" And the client's saying, "No, I don't notice that. I'm not this advanced mover with all of this proprioceptive, you know, that little bit of, we can tell as movers that something's just tiny bit out of alignment." Other people don't have that. They don't have a sensitive enough nervous system in regard to whatever that movement or position is. So visually to be able to see, "Oh, wow, I'm actually bearing more weight toward my tailbone and my pubic bone is reaching away," or I could pull it back a little bit and now I feel it's more level. That's a great way to do it. So I think, whatever you want to cue, you can, but it's really the whole pelvis that has to articulate with the thigh bone, right? So my pelvis is sitting up and it's rolling back and then coming back up to sitting. And it's also communicating with my spine. And that's why in this awkward position, it's so important that we have taken all of these tissues into these different positions so that the lengthening that needs to happen can happen, the awareness is there, that can happen, and all we have to do, hopefully, is give little reminders because the nervous system has done this before. It's just not done it in this way. And so that's really my job as a coach or as a facilitator, is to help the person moving really be able to find it on their own. It's not about it being perfect. It's not about, I get, a little bit cranky with the client because they're not doing it right. It's not about that at all. As long as I know we're on the path of learning, I'm happy with whatever they're doing, as long as we're making progress. And sometimes that's physical progress. They can do a little more today than they did their last session. Sometimes, though, it's a little bit more mental knowledge of, I know what I'm working toward. And that's something I ask my students, and even when our students get to the examination, is what does the client focus on? If you give them a home exercise, maybe a Pilates exercise, but you also may give them a home exercise that's more of a postural awareness exercise, which is find this alignment and change the, depending on which country you're in, change your rear view mirror, right, in both northern and southern hemisphere and right and left side of the car, to help you remember. And then when you can't see out of it because you've come into this slouchy position, don't reach up and change it again. Sit back up and get tall. So you have these little reminders. Eventually you don't need them because you're really competent doing that thing. You don't have to think about it anymore. But I want to make sure that I'm giving information to my students so that they know how to practice at home. I don't hear that all the time. "Oh, you're going to do the 100 at home, off you go." Well, how do I know what to do? How do I know what to focus on? It's our job to tell them, and not just the choreography. What's really important for their body, right? We have the basics of what these exercises are about. They're more about control, they're more about mobility. They each have their own choreography. All of those things are really important. But how do I get my body to do that the best that I can? And then taking that responsibility as a teacher is, how do I get my students, my clients, how do I get them as close to that point as possible so that they really are experiencing the exercise fully, even if it's not, right? Even from the outside, it doesn't look like that. That's okay. How do we do that? So I encourage you, and I think most teachers now are leaning in that direction. We're not just counting and telling people about the choreography. My new bumper sticker, well, it's not that new anymore, but my new bumper sticker or t-shirt phrase is, if you're counting, you're not teaching, right? We don't need to count for the client to be, it doesn't matter if you do 8 or 10 or 12 of something. It might matter if you're doing something that is very intensive, right? You might not want to do too many. But I can give so much information to the client that helps them do it better. But if I'm just saying, and roll up and roll down, and roll up and roll down, and inhale 2, 3, 4, 5, I'm missing that opportunity to figure out what do they need and what can I tell them that will really help them in their performance of all these exercises, and how does it all link together? Yeah, I'm seeing more and more and more that clients are starting to come into the teacher training, and I think that's wonderful. They have such knowledge in their own bodies of the movement, sometimes a lot more than people who maybe are career changers and I want to now become a Pilates teacher, but I haven't done much Pilates in my own body. That's where the clients actually have an advantage because they've been learning this whole time. All right, I see another question. Rosanna, thank you. As a person learning this for the first time, do you cue rotating from the rib cage up or allow a bit of pelvis rotating from the bottom of the spine? Yeah, what I want and what I get are two different things. So I do want rotation really happening from the rib cage. So as I'm on the chair, my pelvis is set there. I'm rotating from as low in my rib cage as I can. I really almost think about my waistline rotating. And then I go and 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 I get to that point. And then I derotate. Sometimes I'll talk about the shoulder girdle being the first thing. For some people, I will come back from the lower ribs, but that also sometimes when I return from there, I see clients want to go into a little bit of extension. So that sometimes is not what I want. So then I'll talk about, so you ripple through the rib cage and around and the shoulder girdle turns, and then turn back from the shoulder girdle and kind of reverse your steps there. I really do want the pelvis to stay level if possible. But like I said, there's so many people who don't have that capacity. They start to rotate. They only can go so far. And if at the very end their pelvis turns a little bit, but they're in control, I'm fine with that. And thinking, just as thanks for asking that question, Rosanna, because it just made me think of some of the short box work that we do. If you're going to do, and again, different schools have different names for it. I learned it as spear the fish. So you have a dowel in your hand and you go back in rotation. You're sitting on the short box, your feet are under the strap, and you go into rotation, and then you take your dowel and you take it out and you take it to the floor, and then you come back up. At a certain point, to have your spine in control, you actually do rotate through the pelvis just a little bit. But it's that last thing that happens. It's not rotate your pelvis and then do the movement. It's move, and then at the very end, if needed, the weight may shift just a little bit. So I'm okay with that on this exercise too. Again, it's not about it being completely still and perfect. That's a goal we go for, but it's certainly not required. So I hope that answers your question. Let me just look back through. I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything in the chat. Okay, good. Yes, Christy or Christine, I can't see your whole name on my side. Christine, there we go. Can you repeat one more time your definition of neutral? Yes. And this is not my definition. This I really take from Brent. And different people have very different definitions of this. So just know that you may learn it this way, and you may talk to somebody else and they may say, well, that's not right. But this is how we define it. It is the position of the joint. So if we're talking about the spine or the pelvis, it's the position where we have the most available ranges of motion, depending on what that joint already comes with, to move in, right? It's kind of the center. And sometimes I'll use like a standard transmission on a car, right? If you have first gear is up here and over and down is reverse, and I know they're all different, but if you have that kind of that H model going through the center, I can be in the middle in neutral, and I can get into first gear or reverse pretty quickly because I'm there, and I'm not anywhere yet. I'm just in the center. If I'm in first gear, but then I need to reverse quickly, it takes me longer. I'm already over here. And that's kind of how our spine is. If I'm already in flexion, right, I don't have as much range of motion in other range in other directions, because we've taken up that available movement with movement, right? That goes back to Fryet's law of movement in any one direction will stop us a little bit from having movement in another direction. It's just how much available motion we have, and we've already used it up in one direction. We don't have as much available in the other directions, which is fine because we do combine movements all the time. But as a starting place, we like to get that centered position of the joint so that I have any different range of motion available to me at any time, right from the get-go. Okay, it's not to hold it. It's not such a rigid idea of it. It's a little bit. It's more of a concept of that. So that's what we talk about. So we do, and we're thinking about, I've got to have some sort of image or some way to portray that to somebody. We'll talk about the curves of the spine. All right, so you have the curve inward at the neck, outward at the thoracic, inward at the lower back, and outward at the pelvis. So as long as you're maintaining that, you're probably close to your neutral alignment. We can talk about how the pelvis and the spine communicate, right? So the pelvis isn't tucked under or overly arched. We're in the center. We're at the center then again sitting on top of the femur, or that alignment. But again, in a different, maybe I'm in position, you might have heard it called hook lying, where I'm lying down supine, my knees are bent and my feet are flat, like you're going to do a bridge, right? Now the relationship of my femur is a little bit different. I'm already in flexion, but that might be the starting position. So again, it's not so rigid. I hope that helps with the definition, Christine. And then Rosanna, what springs do you use? What do I use? I use a white spring somewhere near the top. Remember that, guys, when you're doing springs on the chair, the higher you can set the spring, the more it's going to bring the pedal up. So if you have a choice of using a spring that is lower and high, one that's higher, one that's lower, and they're about the same tension, for this exercise, you'd want to go with the one that's a little bit higher, the setting. Like maybe a black spring down lower could work, but a white spring or a lighter spring up higher is also going to pull the pedal up a little bit. So you're going to get support earlier in the movement. Important for a lot of chair exercises, especially if you're on a combo chair and not a wounded chair. A wounded chair, the pedal comes really close to the top of the chair. The combo chair, it doesn't come up quite so high. So you want to maximize that as much as you can. So I'm on a white spring somewhere up there. When I do teaser though, and this is where it comes a little bit different, I take the spring a little bit lighter. If I'm going to do teaser on the chair, I'll drop it down to a white spring more in the middle or sometimes even lower, depending on how heavy the springs are, how new the chair is, because I want to be able to open fully and close fully up into the teaser, going up and down. And if the spring is too heavy, I lose that leverage and body weight to push down enough. So really common mistake when people are learning teaser on the chair, they think, oh, I need to have a lot of help. So they put on a lot of spring tension, but then you can't go back. You can't actually lean back into the springs because they're so heavy. So you might just, as you're playing around with your springs, go maybe a little bit lighter on that. And again, everybody's different and every chair is different. So again, no more. I've been using this idea of light, medium, and heavy. And on any piece of equipment, do you need a really heavy spring that is either going to provide resistance or maximum assistance? Are you just kind of medium? It's not too heavy, not too light. It does what it needs to do, kind of supports the body. Or is it quite a light spring where you want a lot of challenge and not much support? Or you have to move the spring with a body part that maybe is not as strong, like arms versus legs, and you just need a lighter spring. So that's another way you can think of it. Well, everybody, I hope that this has been helpful, that I see comments later on in other communication, or when I see you in person, and you're like, oh, it's so much it's so much easier now. That's always my goal, is to make it easier, more accessible. If you ever have questions, please reach out to us. We take your communication really seriously. So I try to do it as much as I can. We have a big spreadsheet of all these topics. So keep sending us ideas, and please have a great rest of your week and weekend. As Brent would say, please remember to be kind. Thanks so much for joining.